Okay, so this is the session on choosing an enterprise encoder, and I want to start off by telling you what's covered and what's not. So if you want to leave, you can leave early, not wait till the very end and say, goodness. Start off by talking about what an enterprise encoder is and how it's different from a desktop encoder, and then look at the classes of enterprise encoders to kind of focus your attention on the type of product you should be looking at for the needs that you have. And then we'll talk about the points of differentiation. Once you know which class of encoder you need to buy, we'll talk about some ways to differentiate the different candidates. Some are testing oriented with qualitative and performance tests. Some are pricing and other things like that. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what's coming, maybe some things you can see out on the show floor if you go talk to the vendors who are out there today. Okay, so this is going to cover, we're covering enterprise encoders. We're covering the on-demand encoding side only, not the live side. So yesterday we had an hour-long session on choosing a live encoder. This is on demand. And we're looking primarily at desktop and mobile and compatible markets. We're not looking at encoding for broadcast use. It's not cable, it's not satellite, it's streaming distribution. And then I'm also focusing on local installations here, not cloud. So not going to cover the cloud encoder. I think that's a pretty interesting market, particularly in the live area, but it's not something I'm going to talk about. So let's, what is an enterprise encoder? And we know Sorenson Squeeze. Sorenson is a pretty well-known company in the streaming space. They've got a Squeeze server, and they've got Squeeze desktop that costs $1,000. And then they've got, Telestream has Episode Engine, which costs $3,000, and then Episode Pro that costs $1,000. So, what's the difference between the desktop versions and the enterprise versions, and when do you want to choose one over the other? So here's some concepts that we're gonna talk about throughout the presentation. You get an enterprise encoder for shared use. So, Squeeze Desktop is a product you can install on your desktop and encode, but you can't really share usage of that very easily. You get an enterprise encoder because you want to share use via watch folders, via direct user interface that people have access to, or programmatically via an API. So Episode Engine has an API, Episode Pro does not. Typically, you'll get the highest performance in the enterprise encoder class. Episode Engine differs from Episode Pro because it's got full parallel encoding. Episode Pro does not have that, so Episode Engine will deliver multiple files much faster than Episode Pro will. One really big point between desktop and enterprise encoders is the whole concept of scalability, the ability to build a server farm. You can't do that with Squeeze Server. Can do it a little bit with Episode Pro, but you can't really, you can't have a single point of control, multiple encoders with failover. If you're building a farm for high volume, multiple computer operation, that's when you want to look at the enterprise encoder class. This is a point of differentiation with some products, but typically the enterprise encoder class will give you all the relevant outputs, including video and manifest files. Some do. Most of the products have a way of getting there. So you've got single file H.264 in Windows Media. You've got HLS output, both the chunked content files and the metadata files. You've got HTTP dynamic streaming, same thing, chunked content files and manifest files. And then most enterprise encoders have Dash on the drawing board, if not currently implemented. Now, how many people care about closed captions and what they're typically not a product typically not a feature you can get in a desktop encoder. In fact, I'm not aware of any desktop encoder that provides that. It is a tool in some, but not all, enterprise encoders. So this is a real point of differentiation between the products we'll be talking about. And then DRM support is another one that most, you can't really get good DRM support in Sorenson Squeeze or in Apple Compressor, another desktop encoding tool, but that's something you start to see in a lot of the enterprise encoding tools. And then the programmability side, you want to have an API, you want to have a plug-in architecture. That's how Squeeze Server differs from Squeeze Desktop. Enterprise encoders can be hardware, they can be software. and they can even be command line. So we all know that YouTube uses FFmpeg to perform their encoding. That's a command line encoder. It's hard to say that's not an enterprise encoder because YouTube encodes more files than anybody by a huge margin. So I don't think FFmpeg is a real good candidate. We don't have the engineers that YouTube has, but it's something that needs to be in the conversation. Okay, so that's what an enterprise encoder is. How do you focus your attention on which type of product you want to buy? So I see these products as falling into three classes. And obviously you need to identify which class you're buying in before you start shopping. So class 1 is kind of the Swiss Army knife transcoder. You've got a bunch of editors, you've got a bunch of camera formats, you've got output to Avid DNx HD, you've got output to ProRes, you've got to input all those formats, output all those formats. You need a tool that can do all that stuff. And that's not something that a lot of hardware tools can do. Some of the hardware tools are very focused on encoding limited source files to H.264 output. And they're wonderfully fast at that, but if you need more general file handling capabilities, you want a product that falls in the class of the Swiss Army knife transcoder. And then this is, I guess the poster child for high volume encoders is the Elemental server. It's an on-demand encoder, it's GPU based, and it's the fastest encoder of multiple files that I've ever tested. So if all you need is a high volume H.264 encoding, that's the type of product that you want. And there's several tools in that class, but if you don't need the wide file compatibility, you don't need a lot of input-output support, you just want H.264 slamming through, this is the type of product that you want to be looking for. And then the third class of product is how many people apply QC to every file they send out? Okay, how many people feel guilty about the fact they don't apply QC to every file? So I mean, my appreciation for QC, I do a lot of consulting, and then I took a conversion job that involved, I guess the producer had like 4 DVDs. They were all like 3 hours long, and we converted them to 12 adaptive streaming files. So, if you're doing 1 or 2 minute files, you can just look through it. Is there a mistake? Is there not a mistake? But if you're doing 12 3-hour files, I mean, that's 36 hours of watching, which obviously you can't do. But you sit there, and the client was really very much a stickler for perfection. And, sending those files out made me very, very nervous. Is there a break in the middle? Is there some issue that I'm not seeing? So that really gained my appreciation for the role of quality control in my little compression shop. So I can imagine if you're a post house or if you're any kind of service provider, you've got a bunch of files coming in, a bunch of files going out. It would be nice to have at least some minimal verification that there's no breaks, there's no audio breaks, it's not all black through various portions of it, either on the incoming side or on the outbound side. You don't want to waste time encoding files that are wrong anyway. So the workflow systems products, the Swiss Army knife products, they want to just do all your file encoding for you. The big iron encoders, they just want to slam through H.264 files. The workflow systems products, they want to change your life. They want to integrate encoding with quality control both on the input stage, so you don't encode any files that are wrong. You don't waste those encoding resources on files that have some fundamental problem. And they can also make encoding decisions based upon either the metadata. Is this a 4x3 file? Well, let me put it in this bucket and use this preset. So they can do that on the front end, and they can also do it on the back end. Is the signal-to-noise ratio too high? Do we need some kind of visual verification that this file's okay? Yes. Okay, put it in this bucket and send an email to this gentleman or this woman and let him or her take a look at the file. So that's the kind of stuff that the workflow system products do. And as you can see, I mean, these are very, very distinct classes of product. I tend to think that, the workflow systems are very, very, very interesting products. Clearly, and let me make the point, you don't need a workflow system to do quality control. I mean, there are a bunch of third-party quality control systems out there. You can drop all your files in a watch folder. They can pick them up in the watch folder. They can analyze them. So you don't need a workflow system to quality control your files. But if you want to do encoding decisions based on metadata, if you want to do self-healing workflows, this file looks terrible at 1 megabit per second. Well, let's try it at 1.2 megabits per second. Then that's the kind of stuff you need a workflow system for. And I think this is, somebody take a wild screaming guess what the negative of workflow systems are. Anybody? Yeah, there's two, cost and complexity. So, and we'll take a look at that kind of right now. So this is Harmonic ProMedia. Harmonic seems to change their product names every 2 or 3 years just to confuse people. Carbon Coder is in here somewhere. Carbon Workflow Systems is in here somewhere. And basically what you see is you've got the workflow controller software here that can retrieve the file from an FTP. It sends it to this Omnion Media Grid. They probably put Omnion in there because it's one of their own products. They take the file in from the FTP server through here. They do QC on the way in. Which bucket do we put it in? Are there any errors that we should not transcode? They send it through Carbon Coder. They through it through quality control again, and then they send the file out to the playout server, out to FTP. So that's kind of the high-level workflow. This is kind of nuts and bolts. This is how you set it up in the Harmonic workflow system. Pretty, it looks complicated, but it's actually pretty easy. This is the basic building block is called a workflow. And in the workflow, you can have pre-transcode tasks, and that can be, quality control check. Okay, if there's an error, send that to Jan Ozer. Filter the incoming file, deinterlace it, and then transcode to these 8 presets. And then once those are encoded, check the SSIM, check for drop frames. If there's any errors, send a message to Jan Ozer. If there's not, send it to Jan Ozer's FTP site. And if there's any kind of job failure, any step of the way, send an email to Jan Ozer. So that's kind of how you set up Carbon Workflow System. This next slide is kind of could be upsetting to non-programmers, such as myself. But this is how Telestream Vantage works, and it's a very logical setup. It just makes absolutely no sense to me. But the various these are the various questions, and this is how they interrogate a file coming in. They assess the height, and then it's like, okay, is this ST or HD? Is it letterboxed? Depending on the answer to those questions, you use this preset to encode the file, and then you move it to the next stage process. So it's a very, for all 14-year-old sons who are programmers, but it's just, if you're an encoding person, it's a little bit challenging. But I think, whether it's the workflow system approach or the Vantage approach, I think this is a very important option to consider if quality control, if you want that integrated to the process. And I think every major vendor is going to have a solution like this. So Digital Rapids has their Kayak system. Telestream has Vantage. Vantage now has a GPU accelerated hardware component. Rosette has workflow systems. So I think this is something you're going to see. You're going to see an option like this from most major vendors going forward. The pros of workflows, again, you get branching, quality control, self-healing workflows. If the file isn't good enough at 1 megabit per second, we'll try it at 1.2 and see if that improves it. And the cons are cost and complexity. Harmonic gets $20,000 for their system, and Vantage, it's an $8,500 additional module. I don't know the pricing on the Digital Rapids product. So again, the 3 types are very distinct, and each has their, not everybody wants every one of those, but you should. That's the starting point, and these are kind of the who's who in the encoding taxonomy that I just set up. So Swiss Army knife, you can read the names as well as I can. High volume encoders, again, elemental servers, the fastest that I've seen, but there's a lot of very competent companies represented in that category. And then the 3 workflow systems that I'm aware of are the ones listed there as well. So step 1, if you're buying an enterprise encoder, is what class of encoder are you buying? And once you know that, then you can start looking at individual product differentiators. Now you can, I'd love to give you detailed facts and figures about every product in this sheet here, but I just don't have that kind of information. So I've looked at some of these products, have product information from some others. I'm going to give you some product information and some performance statistics for some of these products. I'm going to give you questions you should ask before buying, but we don't have the ability to give you all the information about all the products in all these categories. My goal here is to, identify the features that really make a difference. We'll talk about quality. Every vendor says our quality is the best available. Our scaling and deinterlacing is the most complex and wonderful. And, I've just not seen any meaningful difference in quality. So when I look at encoding tools, I just kind of throw the quality side out because they're all good tools. They all produce. They've all got wonderful reference clients. They've all got wonderful engineers who test quality. So, quality to me is kind of a given, kind of a commodity. And we're going to talk about the things that do make a difference in the remaining 45 minutes. So here are the things, if these products cost anywhere from $3,000 to $36,000 or even higher. So, this is not something you buy. It's not like compressor. Let me spend $39 and I'll just pick up a copy. You really do have to do some due diligence before you make a buying decision. And these are the kind of things that, determine suitability. Does this product fit in my workflow? Can I actually use it? And then once you narrow down the candidates that actually meet those requirements, you can start to differentiate those products. So again, for those who weren't here when I started, this handout is currently available on my website. It's at streaminglearningcenter.com. It's the handout for choosing an enterprise encoder. I realize this information is very dense and hard to see in the back, but the PDF is available now, so that can kind of help your analysis either now or later. So the first thing you want to focus on is does the encoding tool handle the files that I'm working with? If you're working with ProRes files, can it handle ProRes? If you're working with AvidDNX, that's a pretty big deal. If you're working Cineform, that's another one. I mean, some of these are Windows applications, so you can kind of load the drivers that you need to get compatibility. Others are Linux boxes, so you can't really load the Cineform software on a Linux box to get compatibility with that format. So what I tried to do in here with the red is identify areas of potential concern. Not a lot of people working with ABI files, but if you are, then NVIDIA Forecaster can't handle that. A couple of things for Elemental Server. And I should say errors do exist, but all these spreadsheets were filled out by the company themselves. So if you see any errors, email me, but I got everything independently verified by the companies themselves. Everything you see here has been verified by at least one person in those companies. And then, where are you working? Where are the files that you're working with? So one of the nicest features that I think every enterprise encoder should have is the ability to retrieve a file from an FTP site. Some have it, some don't. Obviously, that's a feature you can add yourself. You can do it manually, but I think it's a pretty convenient product both on the input side, the ability to go out and get a file to encode, and also, as we'll see, on the delivery side. As we saw, there's a significant variance in the capabilities of these individual products. So before you go shopping, identify basically all the required inputs that you have, all the container formats, all the camera formats, all the intermediate codecs that you need to support, and where you need to get those files from. So get that list. That's one of the first things you should do when you decide to go shopping. Do we need a product that works with with some of the exotic camera formats? Yes, no. Do we need a product that works with ProRes? Yes, no. So you need to know all those answers before you go shopping. And then here's the output side. Same kind of analysis, a little bit more detail. I mean, a lot of tools are not supporting VP6. For some people that doesn't matter. For some people that absolutely does matter. So that's the biggest red area here on the codec side. And then does it output in the container formats you need it to output in? NVIDIA doesn't output to MOV. That's pretty important if you're working with ProRes and you're trying to create files for your editors. Not a lot of support for output for AvidDNX. If you need that, maybe you need a Swiss Army knife transcoder type product. And then if you're sending your encoded files out to a playout server, obviously you need compatibility with the formats down here. And then this is where things get a little bit dicey. This is, there are multiple adaptive streaming formats that these products need to support, and you need to support both the chunk file format and the manifest file format. Amberfin is a European product, very popular in Europe. It's got a lot of work to do in this area. Elemental Server should have HDS in Q4 this year, which I guess is coming soon. And then again, can the file be delivered via FTP once it's encoded? I think that's a pretty integral feature in this category. And then same kind of analysis. Before you go shopping, identify all the codecs you need to support, the container formats, the adaptive streaming formats, and all the places you need to deliver those files to. Okay, we see a very significant difference in metadata support. And by metadata, I mean closed caption and advertising insertion. So all the way on the right, Telestream Episode Engine and Sorenson Squeeze, wonderful Swiss Army knife type encoding tools, but they do very little in the closed captioning arena. So these are not good options if you're a broadcaster and you need to start captioning your streaming video like right away. Over here on the extreme left, Elemental Server does a real good job on the pass-through side and does a real good job on the streaming side as well. And then you can see the support here. Identify if you do need to produce closed captioning, identify all the formats you need to support, all the output formats you need with closed captioning, get that written down, and make sure the vendors that you're considering support those, because there is a huge difference in support, as you can see. Okay, this is a pretty interesting area for me. The whole H.264 encoding controls. There's a concept, kind of like probably started by Carbon Coder, that you've got a $5,000 encoding tool. You want to have access to every H.264 encoding parameter that's out there. I tend not to agree with that. I don't really see that that's important. I'd prefer a vendor come up with a good set of general purpose configurations that work with most products, so I don't have to mess with it, because very few people understand how these work. But if you are one of those people, you're gonna, if you need or if you want access to a lot of H.264 fine-tuning controls, you're going to see a big variation in the various products. So this is Sorenson Squeeze. You build your presets for Squeeze Server in Sorenson Squeeze. So you'll be looking at this screen when you're creating your H.264, X.264 based preset. So this is one extreme. This is literally every X264 configuration options Sorenson gives you access to. There's also a preset, so you can also say, well, just use this preset and forget about all that. Just use the preset. I don't want to mess with it. But if you need access, you have it. And this, at the whole other end of the spectrum, you have Elemental Server. So Elemental Server gives you, access to profile, to level, to the entropy encoding, the slices in the frame, and then adaptive quantization on-off. And that's all you get for H.264 encoding controls. Now, from my perspective, as long as the quality is good, I don't care if I have all those controls. I care about the quality. I don't care about how much control I have, because I'm doing general purpose footage. It's really hard for me to fine-tune these controls to get better quality, if my footage is general purpose. So this is not a huge deal for me, but I listened to a guy from Major League Baseball, Joe Inzerillo. He's a brilliant guy, and he knows he wants the fine-tuning controls. He sets up on the third baseline than if it's in the outfield. He sets up an encoder differently at night than he does during the day. So his level of H.264 related knowledge is probably more than 99.999% of the people out there. Certainly more than mine, but unless you're in that class, I think simpler is better. And then, as I talked about, all vendors claim the best quality. I've yet to see a spec sheet that says, we're cheap, but our quality sucks. We're easy to use, but our quality's not quite there. Everybody claims the best quality, and the best quality not only in coding, but in the best quality of every facet of encoding, our scaling, our deinterlacing, our frame rate conversions, everything's the best that there is. And what I've seen is that, The 640 by 360 at 1200 kilobits per second, if you've been to a couple of sessions of mine, you've probably heard me say those statistics a lot. That's like the CNN statistics. So CNN produces most of their files at 640 by 360 at 1.2 megabits per second. And at those parameters, it's not the most aggressive encoding, it's pretty conservative, it's pretty high data rate for that resolution. And if you encode with every enterprise encoder out there, you would see very little difference in the output quality because the encoding is so conservative. You push the data rate down to 200 kilobits per second or 300 kilobits per second, you might see some differences, but at the data rates that most of us are working with, you just see very, very little difference. And here's kind of an example of that. This is a 720p file encoded at 800 kilobits per second. That's very aggressive. So ESPN at this 720p is at 2.8 megabits per second. So this is very, very aggressive encoding. And you see very, very little difference between Elemental on the upper left, Squeeze Server on the upper right, Episode Engine on the lower right, and then ProMedia Carbon on the left. I mean, nobody would look at one of these and say, geez, that's ugly, this looks great. No viewer could tell the difference unless they had side-by-side comparisons, which of course they never do. So this is a very aggressive encode. Here's another frame from the various files that we produced. This might be a little bit sharper than this. But again, unless you see the side-by-side comparisons, you're not going to notice the quality difference. And again, this is a very, very aggressive encode. So if you encoded this at ESPN parameters, 2.8 megabits per second, you would see no difference.
What was the rate and resolution?
Say it again?
What was the rate?
The rate for this one is 800 kilobits per second.
The resolution? I don't know.
Oh, the resolution, 720p.
Okay. Thank you.
So, despite the differences in H.264 configuration options, I think you can assume that the H.264 quality is going to be the same. I will say that tools that rely, we're starting to see a move away from main concept. 3 years ago, every main concept was a real badge of quality. Since then, X.264 has really done a good job with their quality. I heard in the last couple of weeks that main concept has a new release out, but that hasn't filtered its way out into the various tools that I test. So I'll probably test that new main concept encoder in the next few weeks. You can check the streaming media site for results there. But at this point, X.264 is the best generally available codec. But we're starting to see a lot of vendors develop their own H.264 codec. So, I've mentioned Elemental a lot. They've got a GPU-based codec. They developed that themselves. Why? Because, they needed quality, they needed speed, so they needed full control over their own codec. You're starting to see vendors, Harmonic, which is the company that bought Rosette and owns the ProMedia line. They have their own codec coming. Atem also has their own codec. So, with all that said, I just don't, I just tend to ignore the qualitative differences. I don't think they're meaningful. Okay, so that was H.264 quality. Some people still care. Well, who cares about VP6? Anybody? I mean, it's amazing. Last year I asked the question, and like 50% of the people still cared about VP6. Who cares about Windows Media? Okay. Okay, so all the VP6 encoding tools, the quality is the equivalent. So basically go on performance. We'll look at some performance numbers in a second. Windows Media, there is a significant difference in Windows Media output. So if you care about this, you've got to be careful. In particular, both the Elemental Server and Episode Engine, as we'll see on the next slide, the output quality was lower than that produced by Sorenson Squeeze Server. And Episode also couldn't meet the target data rate. So I would not use Episode if I'm encoding any version of Episode if I'm coding for Windows Media. And I would, if Windows Media was an important format for me, it'd be kind of a black mark against the Elemental Server. And here's the, I don't know how well you can see this from the back of the room. This is available on the PDF that you can download, but the Elemental Server output here is noticeably blocky as compared to the Carbon coder output, which is smooth and has no blocks. So if Windows Media is important, then you need to be careful. With H.264, I think it's pretty commoditized at this point. Okay, so that's the quality side. Now, let me jump ahead a slide or two. So we're going to look at this slide, and in this slide, I took a single 5-minute file, encoded that to H.264 VP6 in Windows Media, and then a 52-minute file to 11 presets, and then 24 1-minute DV files to 11 presets. So what this is doing is measuring encoding performance from a file to output files, to single MP4 files. So the problem with that is a lot of us don't use MP4 files anymore. A lot of us use .ts files with metadata for HLS. A lot of us use the HDS chunked. We're not sending out MP4 files anymore. We're sending out these adaptive formats. So each encoding tool has a different paradigm for getting you to those adaptive streaming formats, right? So with Harmonic, a separate tool to get the chunking and the metadata. So that's another step. It's another process. If you need the adaptive formats, you need to factor that into the overall workflow. In addition, some of the encoding tools, they can encode to, say, one set of output files and then use those, say, 8 files for 3 different adaptive streaming formats. So they can produce for HLS, HDS, and Smooth from one set of encoded files. Other encoding tools need to encode that same set of files 3 times to produce those files. So really, linear speed is the thing we can measure, but it's not always the most relevant factor in terms of overall performance. So you really need to know, what am I starting with, what am I ending with, and then for each tool that you consider, what's the workflow for getting to what I need to actually distribute? Because very few of us are distributing, again, H.264 files at this point. So I tested what I could test, which was linear encoding performance. And what I did, all the tests you're going to see on the next slide, except for Elemental, I ran on my 12-core 3.33 gigahertz HPZ 800. So I ran all these tests on my own computer, so the tests should be pretty comparable. I did some work for one of the 3-letter networks. They have 11 files they produce for adaptive streaming, so I just basically use those. It's like, well, it's pretty realistic, I think. It's actually in use by one of the 3-letter networks. So I did 3 tests. I did a single file encode to one 720p format just to test the single file performance. Some people do care about how quickly a single file can encode. I think the most relevant test was the one-to-many. I took a single 52-minute file and encoded it to those 11 presets and measured how long that took. And then I did many-to-many. I had 24 DB files that I encoded to all 11 presets. And then I did that in all 3 formats. Here's H.264, here's VP6, and here's Windows Media. So again, for those who came in late, this handout is available on my website right now, Streaming Learning Center, Distributing Your Video. It's a handout for choosing an enterprise encoder. I realize this is small and hard to see. In H.264, the single file test, this is in seconds. So episode engine, it's got split and stitch functionality. It can take one file, split it into multiple parts, encode each part, and then put it back together again. It's a very fast way of encoding a single file. Squeeze Server has the same thing. I tested the beta. I have not yet updated these for the final version. Both of these were pretty fast in terms of single file encode. Elemental wasn't bad either at 121. This, I think, is the most relevant test. And here's Episode Engine. Here's ProMedia Carbon. That's Carbon Coder. Here's ProMedia Express. This is beta software. This was beta software when I tested it in May. I don't think it's shipping yet. So, I wouldn't get excited about this until it's available. This is Squeeze Server. These numbers shouldn't have changed that much since I ran these tests. And here's Elemental. So what's happened since I produced these numbers with Elemental is they've got I don't know if it's shipping or if it's just announced, but they've got a box with double the GPU density and double the CPU density that apparently encodes these files in about half the time. So I don't know what the cost structure is. It's, Elemental's here. You should talk to them about that. But these numbers should be much faster when I test that tool. But if you're looking at, again, I think this is the most realistic for most producers. And even with the older model, with 2 CPUs and 2 GPUs, Elemental was much faster than any shipping product. So Squeeze Server was 107. I'm sorry, Squeeze Server was 318. So this is 3 hours and 18 minutes on a 12-core Z800. Episode Engine was much faster at 103. ProMedia Carbon, which I thought was really the most efficient multiprocessing encoder I had seen, was at 235, and Elemental was at 2256. So when I say Elemental is the poster child for H.264 slam through, I mean, in this class of product, that's pretty striking. And then not a lot of people working with DV files, but I think it's interesting just to see how an encoding tool handles the administrative chores of encoding that many files. And again, Elemental was at 1227, Squeeze Server was at 67, ProMedia Carbon was at 37. They did a comparatively better job here, and then Episode Engine was at 29. So moving on to VP6, not a lot of people care about this, but ProMedia Carbon was pretty much the fastest in all the tests here. Elemental doesn't do VP6 at all. Squeeze Server had some pretty scary times, some pretty Halloween-like times. And Episode Engine was not that competent as well. And then on the Windows Media side, Squeeze Server had the fastest encoding time, and the quality was equal to ProMedia Carbon. So we saw on a slide before that ProMedia Carbon had really good quality. Squeeze Server's quality matched that, and the encoding times were much faster. So if you care about Windows Media, I think Squeeze is probably your obvious choice. And then here's the ProMedia Express product that we talked about. I think it's got great potential, but it's not shipping yet, so it's hard to really say whether it's what it's going to be like when it ultimately ships. You can't really test encoding speed without looking at quality, and they're not shipping yet, so it's keep it on your radar screen, but it's not there yet. So I mean, from a performance summary standpoint, I mean there are true differences in encoding speed, as we just saw in those slides, but I think it's more important to understand the time to usable output. What's the output that you're using? How does the tool get you to that output? Is it 1 step? Is it 2 steps? And then you can start to look at performance and the encoding step. And the problem is there just aren't a lot of benchmark tests available. I mean, it takes a long time to test one of these products, because you never get it right the first time. It takes a while to learn how to use it. It takes a while to optimize, to make sure you're doing the right things. It's 3 or 4 days, and it's just hard. Nobody's ever going to test all these in any kind of way where you're going to say, well, you're going to have to do a lot of the work yourself. And step 1, what are your inputs and outputs? Step 2, will produce those. If you can bring the tool in and test it, I think that's a great advantage. Okay, one other factor I wanted to talk about. The concept of enterprise encoder kind of has this assumption that you've got this big engine on the hill that everybody sends files to. You got one administrator who sets up the encoding configurations for it, and that's kind of the operating paradigm. I think there's a lot of compression shops out there, particularly those who have editors working, where they need multiple people to create encoding configurations, and they need multiple people both to encode on their own desktops and to encode in this high-volume server somewhere off off their own computers. So there's a couple of products that do really well on the workgroup functionality that you should consider if that's kind of if that fits your requirements. If you need individual user customization of presets, user control over encoding, and then server integration for really high-volume encoding. And that's what workgroup type systems give you. Users can customize encoding options themselves. They can encode locally. for small jobs, and they can also access other encoding resources for bigger jobs. And then there's two approaches to this in this class of product. There's Episode Pro and Episode Engine, which has clustering, and then you have send to functionality from Squeeze Desktop to Squeeze Server. So let's take a look at how that works. With Episode, if you have multiple Episode versions on the same LAN, they recognize each other when they boot up, and you can create a cluster. So, you know, if I'm really busy and I want to send an encoding job off to somebody else who's not there, who's not busy, then I can just send the job to their cluster. It can encode there, or send the job to their computer and it can encode there. If one of the cluster is Episode Engine, then it just does the job much faster. But either way, the user set it up. You don't need any centralized administration. It's very easy to use and pretty effective. The other alternative in this regard is Squeeze Desktop. So if I'm using Squeeze Server, I create all the encoding configurations in Squeeze Desktop. One of the other things I can do is I can send a job to Squeeze Server. So if I publish the job to Squeeze Server, the source files and the presets are sent off to Squeeze Server, and the encoding happens there. So it totally takes it off my computer. I have the ability to create the preset and code locally if I want to, but I can also send the job off to the server. So again, in a workgroup environment, I think these are valuable options to have. Okay, so working with a limited group of products that I was able to look at, I wanted to present pricing in two ways. I wanted to show the pricing of the components for encoding, for quality control, for those products that offered a quality control option, and then a server if you needed a server for the workflow. And the second one talks about a 5-unit server cost with and without redundancy. So, if you want to build a server farm, what does it cost with each of the ones that we're going to consider? Now, some of these are hardware options, some of these are software options. Software options need a computer to run, so I basically factored in the computer at a cost of $8,000. If you think you can buy a computer for less, then change the model. But that's kind of the number I work with when I put these assumptions together. My Z800 cost around $10,000, so it's not totally out of whack. So you're not going to consider just these products. I think what's important here is to understand that if you're looking at a workflow engine, you've got to look at both the cost of the workflow engine, the cost of the encoding engine, the cost of the quality control engine, and then if there's a server farm controller, the cost of that as well. Okay, so Digital Rapid's Transcode Manager, $6,500 with the encoding engine, and then $10,000 for the server farm controller. So this is Digital Rapid's. Elemental Server, $26,000 for their encoding tool, and they kind of cluster together without a server, so there's no problem there. If you want to look at a workflow system, on the Harmonic workflow, it costs you $20,000 for the workflow software. It costs you $6,000 for the encoding software, $6,000 for the quality control component. Squeeze Server is a flat $5,000. There's no quality control, and it clusters together. You don't need to buy any other software to work them together. Same deal with Episode Engine. And then Vantage, Transcode. The workflow software is $26,000. The encoding engine is $5,500, quality control is $7,500, and there's a server farm controller you need to make it work. So $41,000 for the base system pricing if you want all the components on the workflow side. Workflow side here for Harmonic is $32,000. Now, pricing, this is a 5-station encoding farm. What we did with Elemental Server is we only priced 3 systems in this because it encoded so much faster than everybody else. I ran these price computations through the different companies, and Elemental said, well, we're so much faster than everybody else, you don't need as many. You don't need 5 to get the equivalent encoding speed as you do with the other companies. So we just use the number 3 here. And so if you want a 5-unit encoding farm, here's the basic price. You can see the components in each column. If you want redundancy, no single point of failure. Some systems you need to buy another computer and another software module. Some you don't. So this is if you want a totally redundant system. This is what it's going to cost you. If you don't mind lack of redundancy, this is what it's going to cost you. The important thing here is not these particular systems, but just to identify the individual components, to understand how the systems work vis-a-vis redundancy, factor in the price of the computers, and then come up with equivalent costs. Okay, a couple of things that are coming. Telestream, I talked about this a few minutes ago. I'm going to be getting one of these in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but it's Telestream Vantage Lightspeed. So it's the workflow module with GPU accelerated hardware encoding. So I think this is the first workflow system that I've seen that's got GPU acceleration, and Elemental has kind of pioneered that trail. They proved that GPU can be an effective way to produce high-quality H.264, and now we're starting to see the second and third entries into that market. Harmonic ProMedia Express, that's that really fast encoder we talked about beta-wise. I hope to see that pretty soon. Digital Rapids Kayak. Digital Rapids has been talking about this for the better part of 9 to 12 months. It's a workflow tool, and Digital Rapids is a very reputable company. They've got hardware, they've got software, so that's going to be an interesting product when it's out there. And then we talked a little bit about Elemental Encoder doubling the CPU density and doubling the performance. So I think if I'm going to rerun the tests on the Elemental system and probably get those published in the next 3 to 4 weeks. I think they're going to be substantially faster. The couple of reviews you can find, I reviewed the Elemental Encoder. You can find that review here. I reviewed Episode Engine. You can find that review here. There are other reviews I've done of the ProMedia Carbon and some of the older products, but most of those are too old to be useful at this point. Elemental I looked at in March and April this year, and I think Episode Engine is from June. Any questions? I have one question. Okay, let's break for lunch.